In 2019, famed director Martin Scorsese said that he didn't believe Marvel films to be real cinema, since they are the same thing over and over, and that they are more akin to theme park rides. With the internet being the internet, this comment was greeted how you would expect it to be, with grace and understanding. Of course, I'm joking. Everyone filled their collective diaper and went on an op-ed spree the likes of which you've never seen, defending the films brought forth to you by a multi-billion-dollar corporation that controls roughly a third of the American film market. Now, whether Marvel films are cinema is debatable. Scorsese's comment on them being the same thing over and over, though, isn't. This isn't to say they are bad, but they follow a standard formula. You know, come to think of it, it's kind of funny that this criticism came from a guy mostly known for movies with loud gangsters shooting each other, while promoting a movie about loud gangsters shooting each other. It is true, though. Films by Marvel Studios tend not to stray from the path of predictable and formulaic. You don't get to be in their place, having a connected universe spanning a decade, raking in billions, by letting a director run wild with their own vision. It'd be reckless to give one person a lot of power in one film for the sake of something like Scorsese's idea of artistic cinema. That one idea or vision could end up derailing the larger plan when you're dealing with something like an extended universe. Funny how that works. Having something so large, like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, doesn't really lead to creative freedom. Yes, a director like James Gunn was able to put his imprint on Guardians of the Galaxy, and the Russo brothers figured out how to make Thanos into the iconic villain of the modern movie era. But overall, they still must adhere to the vision of the larger universe, and thus cannot truly deviate, and you're starting to see this seep into gaming. The problem is, though, gaming doesn't need to do this. There is a studio out there that tends to get a fair amount of flack in the gaming community for never branching off and continuing to create the same type of open world experience repeatedly, despite their games belonging to a multitude of genres. That studio I'm referring to is, of course, Ubisoft. From the original Assassin's Creed to the upcoming Far Cry 6, Ubisoft has not taken a risk, bringing that same game experience time and time again over the last 13 to 14 years. This jab has been repeatedly thrown at Ubisoft for years now, but just because they're teased doesn't make it any less true. YouTube's most ardent microtransaction hater, Jim Sterling, wonderfully dubbed this blending of genres as Ubification. There is still quite a decent amount of people that aren't aware of this, though. I mean, look at the sales of past Ubisoft games and try to honestly tell me that people are catching on to their drift.
Don't ask questions. Just consume product and then get excited for next products.
I chalk that up mainly to the fact that Ubisoft games are still damn good. Much like a Marvel film, they may not be standout pieces of gaming history, but they're still quite enjoyable to play, thus causing many people not to take notice. Let's take a look at their big flagship properties, and we'll quickly see they all have similar traits. Singular character dropped into a vast open world ready for immediate exploration. Mainline missions are there to advance the story. Side quests help flesh out the world and characters. The map is a real-world location brought to life with incredible detail. Collectibles that dot the landscape, referencing the story or characters or environment. 2 different playstyles for each mission, action or stealth. Enemy strongholds that need to be cleared. Skills and perks that are upgraded through completion of previous things like strongholds or side quests. Weapon crafting that's easy to digest. Costumes and outfits that grant the player different qualities like more movement speed or more defense. All these games follow that same pattern, give or take a few tweaks here and there. The only difference really is which setting and characters are most appealing to you. Ubisoft has clearly landed on a successful pattern, one they built off the backs of Rockstar's Grand Theft Auto and expanded upon to create their own empire in the gaming space. Unfortunately, this style of game has begun to seep into franchises outside of the Ubisoft umbrella. Like I mentioned earlier, there's nothing particularly wrong with these games. They're still high-quality experiences checking off every box that makes up the socially accepted list for a good game. The thing that makes this unfortunate, however, is how it has begun to dominate the mainstream game space, and we just simply accept it.
Don't ask questions. Just consume product and then get excited for next product.
I barely have to look at a game anymore to know that it's going to be an open world experience with light RPG elements. This style of game is tiring, and I want more from big budget studios moving forward because unlike Marvel and Disney, they aren't trying to build an extended universe, and they don't need to necessarily be copy and pasted with each release. Back when Ghost of Tsushima was first properly shown at E3 2018, you could already see some of the open world tropes present. Beautifully crafted historical world, based on a real event too, enemy groups that need clearing, action gameplay first, then a brief look at stealth elements. Looking back at the original demo, which was amusingly confirmed to be a side quest right away, Sucker Punch seems to have stayed true to its original vision. The only reason I bring up the possibility of it changing was because another samurai game was revealed at E3 and released the following year. That was, of course, From Software's Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice, a beautiful action-adventure title that went on to win the 2019 Game of the Year. I thought for sure Sucker Punch would alter things greatly to stand apart from that game. Yes, Sekiro has more to do with the supernatural and Japanese mythology than Ghost of Tsushima does, but to the average eye, they're two games about samurai in feudal Japan. So when Ghost of Tsushima missed the 2019 calendar year, I was thinking it might have, at least in some part, been due to the success of Sekiro. It could have also been delayed for other reasons too, like allowing proper development time management, bugs, and maybe even Sony's own marketing strategy. Whatever the reasons for the delay were, I was disappointed to see that the game went quiet for a year and a half and re-emerged as a standard open-world title. Obviously, we wouldn't get the confirmation of its overall game design until Sony's State of Play 6 months later. You could tell, though, that it was going to be that tried and true open world formula that Ubisoft popularized. But hold on, this is just one game. Didn't I say this style was beginning to bleed out from Ubisoft into other studios? It is. The thing that is starting to upset me the most about this blanket design is that it's being zoned in by one gaming giant in particular: Sony. Sony is very loved in the gaming world. They're seen as a haven for the hardcore, a bastion for the sacred land of dedicated gamers, a place where you can not only find exclusive AAA blockbusters that are remembered throughout time, but also where indies can thrive. It's a space where the big budget companies can dominate and where risk takers are given the green light. That's why it saddens me to see Sony have so many new intellectual properties this generation, and most of them in the latter half be simply Ubified. They started out quite strong by finishing up the Uncharted series with Thief's End, introducing a new chapter in the Persona franchise with Persona 5, and having one of the most memorable RPGs of all time grace their system exclusively in From Software's Bloodborne. As the generation has gone on, though, we've seen them put emphasis on promoting open-world RPG-like titles year after year. The move to open world started to take root in 2017 with the launch of Horizon Zero Dawn. It was Guerrilla Games' first game not named Killzone. You play as a young girl named Aloy in a rich open-world environment trying to find out about her past in this 20-plus hour adventure. Along the way, you level up, complete side quests, increase your skill set, craft materials, and modify your weapons for either a straight-up action approach or a quiet tactical stealth one. If you want to know more about the world, be sure to start exploring and looking for data point entries and emails from the world that collapsed centuries prior. Moving on to 2018, we have one of the most critically acclaimed games of the generation in Santa Monica Studios' God of War. This is a continuation of the Greek mythology hack and slash from the previous generations that is set in an all-new Norse world with a new playstyle. Kratos and his son Atreus overcome obstacles and discover several of the ancient worlds of Norse mythology in this 20-plus hour undertaking. As you battle through these worlds, you level up, craft gear, improve your weapons, and deck your skill set to your liking. Want to know more about Norse mythology? Explore the worlds, help those in need, and uncover Jotnar shrines. Later that same year, Marvel's Spider-Man from Insomniac Games is released solely for the PlayStation 4. In this adventure, you take control of the iconic Peter Parker and his famous alter ego Spider-Man. You sling through the vast openness of New York City, clearing bad guy outposts, helping suffering denizens, acquiring upgrades for your moveset, and costumes for different perks as Spidey takes on a villain that threatens the city in this 20+ hour adventure. Do you want to play this game up front with action? Then make sure you're prepared for the job accordingly by improving Spidey's combat abilities. Do you want to take that sneaky approach? Then switch up webhead style. Oh, and if you want to uncover a little more about Aunt May, Spidey's past, or a lesser-known villain, then start swinging around Queens for those collectibles. Let's jump into 2019, where we get to try out longtime Sony first-party developer Ben Studio's new title, Days Gone. Here you play as Deacon St. John in a zombie-ridden post-apocalyptic open world. The Deacon is looking for his wife, who might still be alive. On your journey across the Pacific Northwest, you'll deal with zombies or freakers, with bombastic action or deadly silent sneakiness. During this whole ordeal, which is a little longer at over 30 hours, you'll be able to take on optional missions like cleaning out infestations and nests of freakers, and turn in bounties to further upgrade the Deacon in his killing quest. That's not all though. You'll be able to improve how he plays by unlocking upgrades and perks. Are you curious about the previous good and not bad world before the outbreak? Well, you'll be able to collect old notes, brochures, and postcards from the past, as well as sermons from the dead from our own Deacon St. John. Tell me, how is this not wearisome? I know Sony is still promoting unique and different games like Media Molecule's Dreams and Hideo Kojima's Death Stranding, but the issue with all the games I just went into detail with is that they are owned by Sony. This is most likely a directive being passed down by Sony as to what they expect from most of their exclusive lineup these days and proceeding into the future. It doesn't quell my fears either when just last year, Herman Hulst, former managing director at Guerrilla Games, was promoted to the head of PlayStation's worldwide studios, where he'll oversee all 14 internal developers within the company. Shuhei Yoshida, former head of worldwide studios, stepped down to focus on external and indie development. The only exceptions seem to be Media Molecule and Gran Turismo developers Polyphony Digital, because even The Last of Us Part 2 ballooned to a whopping 25+ hours and had slight open world traits, with Ellie and Dina on their first day in Seattle. I wouldn't be surprised if Naughty Dog's next title, most likely a new IP, is a busy work open world game with side quests, collectibles, and oh my god, my brain is numb. If you still don't see a potential issue with all this, know that Sony recently announced that it will be sporting a brand new logo for its first-party exclusives going forward with the PlayStation 5. Perhaps this logo would have been a bit more suitable. This is not to say that I have an issue with open-world games on the whole. I love Grand Theft Auto, am a massive fan of the 2018 God of War, and like any other sane person, revere The Witcher 3. I'm tired, though, of big build exclusives for the biggest platform on the market being so damn similar and no one raising concerns.
Don't ask questions. Just consume product and then get excited for next products.
These games continue to review well, are worshipped by the legions of Sony diehards, and sell like hotcakes. Hell, Ghost of Tsushima just became the fastest selling new IP in Sony's first-party library. I see in the reviews for Ghost of Tsushima that some are beginning to take notice of the staleness, but are merely waving their hand over it and still praising the game overall. I fear this will lead to a rude awakening for Sony and others when it inevitably spills over into the next generation, and the enthusiasm hits a wall, thus setting their exclusives back as they try to pivot and figure out how to adjust halfway through. Before I fully dive into Ghost of Tsushima, we must ask ourselves how we got to this point. How did all these big exclusive games begin to reflect each other? I don't think it's something as subtle as when Overwatch became the Trojan horse for the microtransaction cavalcade that is now inseparable from the industry. It is more of a combination of public outcry and demand for more content and the rise of development costs. Back in 2007, Naughty Dog released Uncharted: Drake's Fortune. It was really the first PlayStation 3 exclusive where people began to take notice. Sorry, Resistance. The game came from the developers of Crash Bandicoot and Jak and Daxter and looked incredible. It reviewed well and ultimately sold over 2.5 million copies before its sequel, Among Thieves, was released. People had their qualms with it like any game, But the one that stuck out the most was, it's too short. Clocking in at around 7 to 8 hours, Drake's Fortune was criticized for not giving the player enough to do. Sure, there were collectibles that unlocked concept art, and the game included higher difficulty modes, but for most players, it was a one-and-done experience. This was a debate that was beginning to rise at the end of the previous generation, with the early steps of console multiplayer coming into play. It came to a boiling point when the following generation kicked off with massive online shooters like Call of Duty 2, Gears of War, and Halo 3. There was also the release of a massive single-player game in The Elder Scrolls IV: Oblivion. By the time that Drake's Fortune had come out, it was already a relic. Things were going to change, and change they did. By 2009, multiplayer was everywhere, from Grand Theft Auto 4 to Left 4 Dead 2. Even classic single-player franchises were implementing online co-op, like in Resident Evil 5. Uncharted 2, Among Thieves, followed suit and threw in a multiplayer mode, and gone were the complaints of replayability and questions about the value of a $60 video game. There were a few exceptions like Dead Space and Batman Arkham Asylum, but it was clear that the industry was heading in a new direction. In a 2018 interview, famed games writer and director Amy Hennig, responsible for works like Legacy of Kain, Jak and Daxter, and Uncharted, mentions that with the rising costs of game development, developers need an out for their single-player experiences. Obviously, the 8-hour narrative was and continues to be finished, but the market for a single-player game is far from dead. Most Game of the Year nominees are single-player games, and, like mentioned previously, they continue to sell millions. Unfortunately, spending millions upon millions developing a short, tightly focused campaign is not sustainable. Hennig mentions in the interview how things like multiplayer and live stream games, think Destiny, Grand Theft Auto 5, and Tom Clancy's The Division, as being that out for developers and publishers. Why would developers continue to jump from project to project when they could save money by continuously working on the same project for a lengthy amount of time and satisfying the gamer's want for more content? There is a massive issue with all this, though, and it's something that Hennig mentions in the same interview. When you create a more expansive single-player experience and lengthen the story, it tends to lose focus. On top of the player being less likely to see the end of the game, an issue that is as old as gaming itself, they are not going to be engaged with the story as much because it does not expect them to be. Too many things are competing for their attention in these newer, bigger games. The player must figure out what they want to do each time they boot the game up. Do they tackle side quests? Do they go after that legendary piece of armor? Oh, what about rounding out their collection of trinkets and medallions or click-clacks or whatever the hell so they can get an upgrade point to unlock that combo perk? And I'm just mentioning the games that don't have an online mode, but hopefully you see that this method of design is effective. It keeps the player occupied and engaged with the product for a substantial amount of time, at least longer than in past generations. The developer and publisher are also hoping that the player will stick around for the eventual additional content that will drop as part of the game's roadmap, much like you're seeing right now with Ghost of Tsushima's online co-op player mode Legends that will be dropping this fall, complete with a raid and everything. Remarkable. Alright, I think I have bored you enough with my point about open world titles, how they are the marvel of video games, and what gave rise to them. It is time to talk about Ghost of Tsushima and how it is, and how it stands up next to the other games of a similar nature. In Ghost of Tsushima, you play as Jin Sakai of the Sakai clan, one of the more prominent families on Tsushima Island. You are the nephew of Lord Shimada, the Jito, essentially a samurai steward of the island. The game centers around the Second Mongolian invasion of Japan during the regent rule of the Kamakura period. The game begins with Lord Shimada leading the clans of Tsushima Island in their battle against the Mongols. Both sides are at a standstill on the beach, with the samurai about to head out for what looks to be a suicide mission. Lord Shimada sends out the head of Clan Adachi, Haranobu Adachi, to confront the leader of the Mongols, Khotan Khan, a seemingly fictional substitute for the real-life Kublai Khan. In traditional fashion, Haranobu demands that the Khan face him and battle him with honor. Instead, the Khan throws his wine on him, ignites it with a torch, and cuts his head off. This scene is so damn good, It establishes Khotan Khan as a dishonorable bastard who is not to be trifled with. It is a phenomenal way to introduce a villain and make the player engaged right off the bat. It doesn't stop there either, as the intro continues to keep you hooked throughout the first hour, despite several issues. After witnessing this death, Lord Shimada leads the charge and you take control of Jin, slicing up Mongols along the beach, before you're eventually taken down with several arrows. You try to regain consciousness to save your uncle, but he is struck upside the head by the Khan and taken captive. Meanwhile, Jin lies dying on the beach. Sometime later, Jin awakens in a mysterious home. He's been rescued by a thief named Yuna, who is looking for her brother Taka, a blacksmith, who's been captured by the invading army. She rescued Jin because she knew she was going to need his help in locating and freeing her brother. Unfortunately, though, she sold his katana for food and medicine, but is confident they can get it back. After they do so, she asks for Jin's help in freeing Taka. Jin agrees to do so only after they confront the Khan and free Lord Shimada. Yuna reluctantly agrees and the two work their way to Kaneda Castle, where the Khan has Lord Shimada. Along the way, Yuna shows Jin a new way to approach the enemy, with stealth and cunning. Being a samurai, Jin views this as dishonorable, and not the true way of war. Yuna knows that this trickery and deception will be the only way in which Jin and his uncle will be able to fight the Mongols and maybe even reclaim Tsushima. Still, Jin ignores her and charges headlong into enemies. Remember when I mentioned giving the player their choice of stealth or action? Ghost of Tsushima wastes no time in introducing that. But this is the goal of most intros, to serve as a subtle tutorial, and it works very well here. You learn everything from the basics of stealth movement and killing, to standoffs where you're locked into a potential one-hit kill with an enemy, so long as you would time the attack right. It does all of this while setting up the story and planting the seeds of internal conflict within Jin, as to whether he wants to be a prideful samurai, or adapt and become something else. As Jin begins his internal struggle, we're treated to a flashback of his youth, and him learning the ways of emotional discipline and sword technique from Lord Shimada as a way to introduce combat mechanics to the player. Shortly after that, we're given a look at Jin's father, being killed in a raid on the Sakai village, reaching out for Jin while he hides away, scared from the fighting. The next day at the funeral, as Jin becomes head of Clan Sakai, Lord Shimada takes him on as his personal ward. It's all very emotional, but it's quite a lot to take in. Remember, we haven't even gotten to the end of the intro, and we already have a lot to digest here. The Mongolian invasion, Jin's supposed death, being beckoned for another mission on top of rescuing his uncle, potentially learning to throw aside the honorable ways of the samurai, and now learning about his past with his relation to his uncle and his abandonment of his father when he was calling out to him in his dying breath. Sucker Punch really packed in a lot of stuff for us right away. It gets your blood pumping, but has your head swimming as well. Jin and Yuna eventually work their way to the front doors of the main temple of Kaneda Castle, and Jin has to fight the Khan. This is the player's first look at a boss fight. Like Souls games and Sekiro, the fight with the Khan is a scripted game over fight, where Jin must lose. It's meant to overwhelm the player and demonstrate the Khan's power, and Jin's weakness in the process. Once again, it's effective at what it sets out to achieve. It's yet another thing, though, that's happening in the setting up of the overall narrative. Jin is sliced across the chest and tossed over the rail of the bridge he was fighting on. He plummets to what seems to be his death, but it's another fake-out. Jin has now failed twice before we've even gotten the story off the ground. I'm not sure that Sucker Punch has ever heard the Da Vinci quote, "Simplicity is the ultimate form of sophistication," because they throw the whole kitchen sink at you before the title screen pops up. Thankfully, the roller coaster ends as Jin regains composure and regroups with Yuna. The two avoid a patrolling Mongol unit, and Jin reassures her that he will help Taka along with recruiting a few others, because it's clear that he's going to need help in defeating the Khan. Jin rides out, and we are given our intro screen. Here you're given free reign to explore the entirety of Tsushima's Izuhara prefecture, and over the next several hours of the game, will unfold in all of the ways of the standard open world experience that I mentioned earlier. The main objective in the first act is to recruit a select few people to Jin's side in his effort to take down the Khan. As you take on these tails, as they're called, you'll begin to be hit by the usual open world tropes. You'll start off by following golden birds that lead to points of interest like a hot spring that'll increase your maximum health, or Shinto shrines that you'll pray at to unlock charms. Now these are not to be confused with Inari shrines that will expand capacity for slotting these charms. All this goes towards your light RPG building of Jin. When focusing on the main quest, Jin will need to recruit Lady Masako, wife of Harunobu Adachi, who is seeking revenge on the man who betrayed her family and wiped out her clan. You'll also be seeking the help of Sensei Ishikawa, a legendary archer whose pupil was supposedly taken hostage by the Mongolians. Lastly, in the tale where you help Yuna find Taka, you'll first be rescuing a ronin named Ryuzo. Ryuzo, a childhood friend of Jin's, leads the Straw Hats, and to get him on your side, you'll need to get back the food the Mongols stole from his men. These are all the usual open world missions, but they feel extremely dated here. Whereas the other games I mentioned do indeed follow a similar formula, they try to shake up their missions and keep the player a little more focused. In Ghost of Tsushima, you spend almost every mission starting out on horse, riding alongside the person giving the quest, then you examine footprints, follow someone, seriously, how does this mission still exist, scout a location, and then move in on the enemy's location. The constant horse riding is also detrimental to the Japanese dialogue option. Characters will speak so much that you'll be spending all the time reading that you won't be focusing on travel and end up deviating from the person you're supposed to be accompanying. So I switched it back to English about halfway through Act 1. This is repeated throughout the whole game, from the main quest all the way down to you helping the distraught locals in their plight. It's a shame because it's a world you want to explore. I believe that Sucker Punch has created one of the most beautiful open world environments to date in Ghost of Tsushima, and has captured the historical nature of it so much so that it would make any Assassin's Creed game blush. From its stunning fields and rolling hills, to dilapidated villages and ridiculously bountiful oak trees that seem to shed thousands of leaves a second, Ghost of Tsushima is right on the yen when it comes to creating an aesthetically pleasing world. Nowhere else is this more apparent than in the game's incredibly detailed photo mode. These modes have really taken off this generation, but none have added the level of detail that Ghost of Tsushima has. It has color grading, particle intensity, wind speed, cloud coverage, weather, and so much more. Even someone like me who has the photography skills of someone who doesn't have any photography skills, I was thoroughly enjoying using this mode. As for the history, Ghost of Tsushima does a damn good job of creating an accurate 13th century Japan. Instead of giving you flat-out recounts of actual events, Ghost of Tsushima weaves its fictional characters into the history of the Second Mongolian invasion, the ways of everyday life in the past, and the legacy of the samurai. You'll be able to collect Mongolian artifacts to learn more about their culture, and compose haiku and shame your ancestors with your generic and terrible poetry to get headbands for Jin. You'll also hone your swordsmanship by practicing the art of tameshigiri, or bamboo cutting, and gain resolve, a Hollow Knight style regenerative reserve cache for healing and certain moveset usage. I found the fighting game combo style minigame to be one of my favorite things to do in the entire game. Unfortunately, these fun little distractions are, like I mentioned much earlier, the same old open world tropes just reskinned. They're also bogged down by bland mission design and pretty terrible combat. Seriously, I had major issues with how swordplay and stealth unfold in Ghost of Tsushima. While recruiting warriors of Tsushima Island to your cause against the Khan, I had enough of this combat before I even reached the second act. Throughout the first official chapter of the game, Jin begins to rebuild the forces of Tsushima, as well as the shattered presence of the samurai on the island. In order to achieve this, you will recruit those people I mentioned earlier, as well as help the locals in their individual issues and clear out Mongol camps. Doing all these things will grant you materials for upgrading your gear and weapons like armor and katana. Clearing out strongholds also improves your legend, essentially an XP bar. As you level up, you'll gain technique points that you can spend on a whole array of options, from action approaches via the Samurai tab, or stealth weapons and abilities through the Ghost marker. Jin will be able to unlock so much, like stealth weapons to deflection mechanics like parry and evasive moves such as dodge and slash. If you want, you can even increase your exploration abilities to have the Guiding Wind, a beautiful and subtle replacement for the typical intrusive minimap and highlighter-colored GPS lines, and have it steer you in the direction of certain points of interest. The wind is supposed to be the personification of Jin's father, which is kind of misleading because the relationship with his father is almost non-existent following the flashback in the game's prologue. But I digress. You will use your earned abilities to make combat easier, but I never felt like it succeeds in doing so. Not for the samurai action approach anyway. You can upgrade your katana and tanto and start adding in abilities for both deflection and evasion, but it still feels just so damn sloppy. This is mainly because enemies love to swarm you and the game has a soft lock-on system that cannot be toggled off. I read up on why Sucker Punch decided to do this. They said it was because it allowed for more freedom in switching between enemies as they came at you. This would be a sufficient reason if Jin had more strength in taking down half a dozen enemies, but he does not. This ends up leading to a lot of scrambling, as you dash around trying to finish off enemies while avoiding others. They even throw dogs in there for good measure, which sent my headache into a full-blown aneurysm. Ghost of Tsushima operates in a similar way to Sekiro in that you must wait for a visual cue or time your parry with the enemy's oncoming attack to open them up and get some hits in. Unfortunately, you'll have to do this several times for each enemy, as they don't go down with just a few slices. It doesn't help things either that you'll almost often be surrounded by several different enemy types like swordsmen, shieldmen, or spearmen. And I didn't even mention the big brute type enemies that can knock you to the ground like nothing, evaporating half your health in one hit. You can combat these different enemies by switching to the 4 different samurai stances that you unlock throughout the game. And not in a timely manner either, as I unlocked the final stance in the last act of the campaign. The 4 stances are Stone Stance, which is dealing with swordsmen, Water Stance, which is dealing with shieldmen, Wind Stance, which is dealing with spearmen, and then Moon Stance, which is dealing with brutes. Each stance is unlocked as you increase Jin's legend, and you can upgrade them with those technique points I mentioned earlier on. Sadly, the upgrades are all just increasing stagger damage on enemies by mashing triangle repeatedly. While not nearly as slick or satisfying as Sekiro's combat, it's much more expansive, which I appreciate. But trying to walk into a Mongolian stronghold, facing the enemy head-on, while trying to switch between all these stances accordingly, with success, is a nightmarish undertaking, especially when you back into a wall or a tree and the camera goes straight up your ass. I know the game is called Ghost of Tsushima, but the game's lead protagonist is a samurai, and the game gives you a full talent tree to pursue the path of the samurai. It feels like this is the incorrect option to play as, though. The combat just fights you so much and is extremely frustrating to the point that stealth seems like the only option. Sadly, it isn't much better. At least not initially. From ghost weapons to evolving tactics, it's clear that Sucker Punch put more of an emphasis on stealth than action. As a stealth fanatic, I loved this, but as someone who likes good stealth mechanics, I hated this. While you do have plenty of options to choose from, they're only acquired throughout the story and as you earn technique points for unlocking them. This causes the stealth experience to only truly unfold later in the game in the final moments of the narrative, or endgame content like strongholds or any unfinished side quests. It seems like the path of the Ghost was built more for a New Game Plus rather than a first playthrough. But currently there is no New Game Plus in Ghost of Tsushima, so that's great. There is one coming though in an update along with that raid that I mentioned earlier. I know this isn't like Metal Gear Solid or Tom Clancy's Splinter Cell, where you control a secret ops agent with weapons and gadgets at their disposal from the opening credits. Jin has to slowly peel back his reservations about taking the enemy down in a dishonorable way. He must acquire these weapons and abilities to make his descent into the Ghost. So Sucker Punch is handcuffed by their own narrative in terms of appropriately building Jin into a stealth god. I would have preferred if they had given Jin more stealthy tools early on to combat this problem. The beginning missions shouldn't have just been following people around on horseback and resolving their personal dilemmas. I think that Sucker Punch wanted to make sure that the power progression was felt throughout the entire experience, and that's another reason as to why they held back. They do end up succeeding in this, as you're unlocking upgrades even near the very end of the story. It's frustrating though, because some of these tools and moves, which are story locked, would have made the earlier missions more dynamic, and that you would have had more freedom and creative control over how you approach the enemy, since the game loves to preach that from the onset. When you're playing as the Ghost, you're all but limited to hiding in tall grass and stabbing enemies in the back early on. Doing the required first part of Sensei Ishikawa's quest will grant you the half-bow, but it isn't very effective against stronger enemies, and you'll easily alert the Mongols if they don't die in one hit. You can improve the bow for more damage and a longer concentration, but this goes back to you having to spend time earning technique points. And how do you do that? By either approaching the enemy with base level stealth, or sloppy swordplay. Jin will also be able to unlock other abilities like chain assassinations, which is very effective in dealing with enemies that are facing different angles. There are also wind chimes for distractions, smoke bombs for blinding the enemy, and poison darts for a more lethal and silent approach. But we'll get to the poison darts later. So there are a lot of tools at Jin's arsenal as the game progresses, but they're requiring you to do a lot of early side work to make them available to use in the story mission ahead, and a lot of them have limited use or require the precious reserve of resolve, the thing I mentioned earlier that heals Jin. It doesn't help things either that the enemy is very quick to notice you sometimes, but then other times immediately forget about you, or they're just in nearly impossible situations for a stealth attack. When there are 5 Mongols around a campfire, it makes your stealth path pretty damn difficult. Sekiro had this problem as well, and felt like the stealth was more suited for a second playthrough. The thing that kinda kills me the most though, is that some of these supposed stealth options don't really seem to be geared towards eliminating the enemy quietly. If you go into the Ghost tab menu, you'll see that the black powder bomb is there to stagger an enemy, and the visual cue that accompanies it, another thing that these open world light RPG games love to do, has Jin running up to the enemies to slice them. The smoke bomb has Jin using it in the middle of combat. The kunai, personally my favorite weapon, is used to stagger enemies while you're fighting them or make it easier to get some hits in on them. It seems more that the Ghost is not necessarily a ghost in the sense of being quiet and haunting without being seen, but more of like a demonic killing machine. This demonic reputation begins to build as Jin works his way to rescuing Lord Shimada from the grasp of Khoten Khan. As you help people and complete missions, they start mentioning the Ghost moniker. It would have been really cool had this been a slower build-up, but it comes on suddenly. One minute he's Jin, and the next he's the Ghost. It's disappointing because this happens when you're in a village that's finding their footing after the invasion. It feels like you'll be building this area up and will become a near mythical figure to the people, but it's just one of many towns that are there to serve as a hub for Jin to purchase and upgrade his loadout. Jin uses that loadout to finally storm Castle Kaneda and rescue Lord Shimada. Lord Shimada is being kept alive as part of the Khan's plan to storm the mainland and take down the shogun. Using what Jin has learned up to this point, he works his way to where the Khan is keeping Lord Shimada. Before he can get there though, he's betrayed by Ryuzo. Unless you did one of the optional mythical tales, more on that in a bit, this is the first legitimate boss encounter in the game. It's a simple and satisfying version of normal combat where you're watching your opponent like a hawk, waiting to see if you should dodge or deflect and counter appropriately. Unfortunately, it's also a one-trick pony. This boss battle system never evolves in the entirety of the game. From the optional fights to the final clash, what you are seeing with Ryuzo is how it's going to be the whole way through. Whereas Sekiro took you on a wild experience that pushed your skills and timing to the limit by switching up the encounters continuously, Ghost of Tsushima can't get out of first gear, aside from the stunning cinematic locales where the fights take place. Other than a few move alterations in the different fights, once you've taken down Ryuzo, you'll be ready to take down everyone. To make matters worse, you can't even use the moves, except for the mythic art Dance of Wrath, and items you've unlocked. It's a restricted experience that falls as fast as it rises. These fights would have been much more dynamic had they changed between each encounter or incorporated secret movesets that you had to learn to properly combat. Even in the Mythic Tales, which are these cool optional missions that delve into legendary fighting techniques that have been passed almost into legend on Tsushima Island, the fights don't differ. Hell, there's one where you must defeat 5 Straw Hat Ronin to earn your chance at fighting a 6th Straw Hat Ronin. It boils down to you deflecting a blue light or dodging a red one, and it isn't particularly difficult, seeing that they all have similar moves to the one in the main story as well. The only different option that a Mythic Tale has is that near the end of the boss fight, you'll be able to execute the move you're trying to learn. This makes it seem like it's mimicking a more advanced tutorial rather than a challenging boss fight. Getting back to the fight with Ryuzo, we understand that he not only betrays Jin because the Khan promised his men an abundance of food, but because of Ryuzo becoming embittered over a dueling loss to Jin in Lord Nagao's tournament back when they were children. This ended their friendship, unbeknownst to Jin and the audience. When any media does this, it's problematic. It was infamously done in Star Wars Episode 2 Attack of the Clones. Early in the movie, we're introduced to an older Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker. To establish that they've had experiences and bonding moments together, they recount them in an elevator, and the viewer is expected to just take it at face value. How are we supposed to connect with Jin and Ryuzo on a deeper level when we have no idea how this event in the past played out? There's a lot of other things going on in the game, so one might overlook this, but we've already gotten to see Jin's past with Lord Shimada and his father, so why not with Ryuzo? This would go a long way in helping us feel something between the two, since this is Jin's oldest friend and the two have a rivalry that lasts until the final act of the game. So this moment loses impact because it actually teases something that never comes to fruition. Ryuzo manages to get away, and I was left thinking that this could end up being a great conflict that would develop as the game went on. Sadly, it really doesn't amount to much more than a few scenes where Ryuzo is the Khan's lapdog. After the stalemate with Ryuzo, Jin heads to the main room where Lord Shimada is being held, only to find that the Khan has just up and left and you're free to simply rescue your uncle. The Khan had left to take Castle Shimada with the help of Ryuzo's men. This moment, to me, is completely ridiculous. The Khan had to have known Jin was coming with a decently prepped army. The leader of the Straw Hats must have informed him of this, and he still decides to leave and entrust the security of his most valuable commodity in dealing with the Shogun to a recent turncoat? This is a baffling story choice that undercuts Khoten Khan's dominating debut and seems only to have been done to extend the narrative of keeping the Khan in the picture. With Lord Shimada safe and Castle Kaneda secure, the warriors of Tsushima begin to form a plan to take down the Khan. Again. He's now taken Castle Shimada after forcing Ryuzo to atone for his mistake by killing hostages that lead to the locals opening the gates of the castle in order to stop it. I didn't feel that the Khan established himself as more of a threat in the second act than in the first, but it's clear Tsushima is going to need a little more help, so Lord Shimada organizes a plan to get a message to the mainland and call in the Shogun. The second act of the game takes you to the Toyotama Prefecture and continues what you were doing in the first act: quests, strongholds, and flower picking for different colored outfits. Of course, you'll be able to improve Jin's legend further and acquire new abilities, but since we've already talked about that, let's focus in on the story. Lord Shimada has a plan to recruit a pirate named Goro to deliver a message to the mainland Shogun that they need help. So Jin escorts Goro to a ship and blows up a bunch of Mongolian fleets to clear the way for Lord Shimada's pirate friend. Upon returning to his uncle, Jin is met with the news that Lord Shimada plans to formally adopt him as his son and heir. This uplifting moment is met with some tension though, as Lord Shimada has learned of Jin's new ways of fighting. Being the head samurai on the island, Jin's uncle obviously disapproves of his new tactical approach in dealing with the Mongols and tells Jin to turn back from this path of the ghost before it's too late. This begins to create a conflict between the two, as they have different ideas on how to handle the enemy and save the island. I was thinking that this was going to be heading into a possible discussion on the samurai and their lordship over citizens, but the game doesn't step into that territory. It keeps the conflict centered on Lord Shimada and Jin and the cliché ideas of honor. For a game that includes an Akira Kurosawa mode filter that for some odd reason has classic scratch grain over the letterbox, after the legendary filmmaker, known for his samurai epics, they must have glossed over a certain speech in his most iconic film, Seven Samurai. In the movie, one of the samurai, Kikucho, tells his brethren that the farmers they're protecting act out because the samurai of the country throughout the generations has brutalized the poor and treated them like property. I would have dealt with a lot of the game's shortcomings and predictability had it started this kind of conversation. It would have been incredible to see it tackle something that not a lot of games do. But, just like its gameplay, it falls into classic tropes and doesn't have anything interesting to say beyond honor codes. I will say that Sucker Punch does do a good job of unraveling the relationship between Jin and Lord Shimada though. I felt bad as I continued to play and do the things that I knew would upset him, but I also felt like a rebellious teen and was muttering to myself about how he was just a dusty old fart who didn't get it. Despite this bickering, the goal remained the same: build an army and defeat the Khan. Jin manages to gain the help of a group of warrior monks led by a man named Norio. This is like the recruiting missions in Act 1, but you don't even need to pursue the final bit of this side quest to get Norio to join your cause. He just does it automatically for some reason. The warrior monks alone are not enough, however. Lord Shimada needs an army, and the only one that is still formidable on the island is in Yarikawa, the hometown of Yuna and Taka. Yarikawa were a clan that initially rebelled against Lord Shimada's rule sometime prior. So, needless to say, they aren't jumping at the chance to help their former conqueror. They change their tune though when the Mongols show up in force and Jin and his ragtag group of fighters beat them back. During this battle, we're introduced to something new: Ghost Dance. This is like an enraged mode akin to Spartan Rage in God of War. After Jin successfully kills a handful of enemies without being touched, you can hit the analog sticks to make the screen go black and white, and Jin just starts slicing enemies up. It's extremely cool and power fantasy fulfilling. But I wonder why Sucker Punch waited so long to introduce this. At this point, the player is more than halfway done with the game, and we just now are getting this ultimate power-up move? To me, the pacing just feels completely off. I understand they need time to build up Jin into the ghost, but it also feels like they held it back for the purpose of extending power progression. It creates an uneven experience that holds moments like this back from what they could have been. Now that everyone has been recruited and the Shogun are set to arrive, Lord Shimada and Jin get ready to take back Castle Shimada. Before this happens though, Jin learns that Ryuzo is stationed at Fort Koyasan, along with the Mongol forces. He knows that taking this fort would be a huge advantage for them in the coming battle, plus it would mean getting rid of Ryuzo. In the night, Jin gets ready to head out and scout the fort. He asks Yuna to come with him, but she says that she's done with the fighting and seeks to head to the mainland with Taka since this isn't their fight. Jin reluctantly lets her go on her way, but Taka differs from his sister and goes after Jin, wanting to help. Jin refuses to let him get involved, but Taka is persistent and convinces Jin to let him serve as a distraction to the enemy so that the ghost can sneak in and confront Ryuzo. This distraction works perfectly, but Jin is ambushed when he gets to Ryuzo's room and is knocked out. He awakens to find himself tied to a pole with Taka opposite of him. Taka came back to see what happened to Jin since he was gone so long. This was not the move to make on Taka's part. The Khan comes to confront Jin and address the ghost he's been hearing so much about. After this offer of a peaceful surrender is refused, the Khan then turns to Taka and tells him that he'll be free if he kills the ghost right then and there. Taka contemplates it for a second, but turns to the Khan and tries to take him out instead. Koten sees this coming a mile away, sidesteps Taka, strikes him down, and takes off his head. To me, this moment was done very well. It's clear that Sucker Punch knows how to create emotional moments, but just can't seem to stay consistent with them. Right after this, Jin faints, and the Khan apparently just leaves him on the ground and doesn't do anything with him. He lets him wake back up after he blacked out and just left all his gear right near where he was captured. Man, this guy is really stupid. Yuna comes to rescue Jin and grieves for Taka. Their shared dream of the mainland is now dead, and she's all in to save Tsushima. Unfortunately, her allegiance to Jin is about to hit a rough patch, as he's about to do something that incurs the wrath of Lord Shimada. Jin takes on a quest to head back to the home village of Clan Sakai and don his father's armor. While there, he runs into the clan's caretaker, Yuriko. Yuriko is proficient in botany, and Jin asks her if she can make poison strong enough to kill a man. This introduces the blow dart, which is an incredibly useful tool if you're going for a stealthier approach. But, like I mentioned before, it takes so long to acquire that it somewhat defeats the purpose. Lord Shimada then leads his forces into a headlong battle on Castle Shimada. Much like with Harunobu Adachi, the Khan does not obey honor and destroys their forces by lighting horses on fire and wiping the soldiers out on the bridge. Despite having completely failed, Lord Shimada is hell-bent on doing the same thing the next day. This is the moment where Jin can no longer abide by his uncle and must take matters into his own hands as the ghost. He sneaks into the Mongol camp and poisons their arag, or milk. While there, he confronts Ryuzo and finishes him off for good. The Khan is once again not there and went further north. You leave the fort to the guy who screwed up last time? Unbelievable. Anyway, this maneuver secures victory for the forces of Tsushima. Lord Shimada is, unsurprisingly, disgusted with Jin for having resorted to such tactics. Despite having been humiliated twice now, Jin's uncle just can't seem to realize that the only hope they have of beating back the enemy is to undertake less than conventional methods. Lord Shimada knows that once the shogun arrive and find out about this, they'll be out for blood. He pleads with Jin to pin it on Yuna and turn from the path of the ghost before he's lost for good. Jin refuses, and Lord Shimada takes him as a prisoner for his crimes. He also burns the adoption letter that he was going to submit to the shogun. Jin is now imprisoned, and it all seems to be at an end for him. Thankfully, one of the friends you make along the way with Yuna and Taka is a sake seller, and he helps you get your freedom from the shogun. He tells you to meet up with Yuna, who knows about the Khan's whereabouts. Rallying the troops, Jin prepares to storm Port Izumi and put this fight against the Khan to rest. Before he does so, however, he sneaks into Lord Shimada's room among all the shogun to leave a letter for him, telling him of the coming battle up north in the Kamiagata prefecture. Lord Shimada does indeed join his nephew, and they manage to seize the port and take down the Khan before he can sail away. This final fight against the Khan is one of the worst things I've played in quite some time. It starts up as a straight-up traditional boss fight. Once you get his health down to a certain degree, though, it turns into a standard fight sequence where you must fight the Khan and deal with different enemy types, archers, and bombs. This is where the argument of luring enemies away to fight them in limited numbers to make the combat more enjoyable goes completely out the window. You are stuck on a boat in a restricted area and must dash madly around the deck, trying to take down enemies, avoid explosives, and focus on the sword sponge Khan. It's a ridiculously exhausting fight that would have served better as an intense multi-layered classic boss battle. I know by now the true final encounter is going to be with Lord Shimada, but the Khan is still the main antagonist, and to have him go out with such a frustrating encounter was disappointing to see.
We will be remembered forever. No, you will be forgotten.
With the Khan defeated, the island of Tsushima has been saved from the Mongols. Of course, this is an open world game, so you'll still be able to go around and clear enemy forts and build up your legend to how you see fit. Before all that though, Jin has one last matter to resolve. Lord Shimada. He beckons you to Omi village, where he trained Jin as a teenager. This moment isn't anything groundbreaking, but I did find myself caught up in their conflict. Lord Shimada was so desperate for a son, and Jin was the perfect fit for so long, but his refusal to break the chains of his servitude to honor held him back from being a great man. The two reflect on their past before dueling one last time. That lack of boss fight evolution I mentioned earlier is quite noticeable here, even more so than the fight with the Khan. This fight has more emotion behind it than any fight prior. This was the man that raised you into the warrior you are today. You plead with him to see a different path, but he cannot, and thus you have no choice but to possibly fight him to the death. This emotion is undercut by the predictability of the fight. You already know how to counter his moves and dodge accordingly because he does almost nothing different from the enemies that came before him. I felt like I was on autopilot when battling him. Still, the final duel does remain a high point of the game, especially the end. Instead of leaving the player with no choice, you are given the option to end Lord Shimura or spare him. I chose to spare him because of everything that he had done for Jin and the island of Tsushima. He and Jin may never see eye to eye, but I knew that there was still a decent man in there and wanted to show him that the ghost was not a dishonorable, bloodthirsty monster. I wanted to show him who the ghost really was by sparing him, but also leave him with a sense of disgrace over his beliefs and actions. He pledges to never stop pursuing Jin, but Jin knows he won't look very hard and will continue to let the ghost carry on in his quest to completely rid Tsushima of the Mongols. And here we are at the end of Jin's journey. But with these games, the end is really only the beginning of the player's power fantasy and completion of the game's lengthy checklist of power-ups, costumes, and lore collectibles. Jin is immediately thrust back into the world, removing the player from the impact of what just happened, and is expected to continue on to get the truly good stuff or get ready for the multiplayer experience. At the end of the day, not counting its combat flaws and certain narrative decisions, Ghost of Tsushima is a completely competent and well-built game, much like a Marvel movie or a Ubisoft game. And I have no doubt that Ghost of Tsushima is a victim of time. Had this game predated Horizon Zero Dawn or God of War, it would be hailed beyond just simply good. But because it released in 2020 and not 2017, it will be remembered as too much of the same, too late.
Sometimes our only choice is to walk away from everything we know.